Dear friends, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you on this course of biochemic tissue salts therapy. Biochemic therapy, or the tissue salts therapy, came into being around 1874, and it was founded by Dr. Wilhelm Schussler, about whom we shall talk shortly. I am your teacher Ashok Rajguru, and the objectives of this course are to lay a strong foundation in understanding the use and application of these tissue salts. At the end of the course, you will have sufficient proficiency and confidence to use the salts to help yourself, your family, and friends to overcome the common ailments that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. In the second video, we shall see how relevant is the biochemic tissue salt therapy today in view of the great advances made by science. A question that is often asked by people who are not familiar with the biochemic therapy is this just another new age fad? We see so many things on the Facebook, on the internet, and there are experts who claim the benefit of one thing or the other. Let me remind you that this is a therapeutic system that was evolved and developed by a doctor, and he published it after confirming its results in the clinic for over a decade, and that publication was done in the year 1874. So, as I said earlier, Dr. Wilhelm Schussler founded this system in 1874, and he was a German homeopathic doctor. And he was deeply influenced by Rudolf Virchow, who was a Polish scientist and was working in Berlin. And Virchow made some very great contributions to the cell theory. And Virchow's cell theory pointed to the fact that any disease that afflicts us is actually some disturbance at the cellular level. So disease pathology happens at the cellular level, and this happened to have made a deep impression on Wilhelm Schussler. Now mind you, both Schussler as well as Virchow were born in the same year 1821, so they were really contemporaries. Virchow, however, was not just a doctor or a research worker. He was an anthropologist, he was a politician, a leader, and so many other things. We shall now look at how the concepts of biochemic therapy developed in the mind of Schussler. Now, as we said, Schussler was a homeopath, but he found that homeopathy had by far too many remedies to deal with. As a matter of fact, back in the 1800s, maybe there were somewhere close to 200 or 300 remedies. Today, there are close to 3,000 remedies. But in present times, we are blessed with very advanced and sophisticated computer tools, which make it possible to analyze and study a case far more easily than it was possible in Schussler's time. Therefore, he was on the lookout for a simpler system. And as we said, around the same time, he was influenced by the ideas of cell theory and the findings of Virchow. So, in the process, Schussler analyzed the ashes of the dead bodies which were cremated in the hospitals, because his study of the cells taught him that there were some inorganic salts which really affected the organic functioning of the cell. So what he discovered was that there were just a handful, a dozen or so inorganic salts that affected the functioning of a cell profoundly. Also, he found that certain particular salts predominated certain tissues and certain organs. And therefore, he theorized that probably it was the deficiencies or perhaps the imbalance of these salts in a cell that could lead to disease. Now, mind you, this was way back in the 1800s. The microscopes were not that sophisticated, and the literature also was not so freely available across the globe. So it was really a very fertile imagination that helped him to develop his concepts. Now, what Schussler found was that certain salts had certain affinities for certain tissues. For example, in the ashes of the muscle tissue, the phosphates of potassium and magnesium predominated. Also, bone was predominantly calcium phosphate, and likewise the mucous membranes had a preponderance of potassium chloride. So this list goes on, and he found through his very analytical approach and close observation that he could find associations between various tissues and organs of 12 salts. Now, what Schussler found was that certain salts had certain affinities for certain tissues. For example, in the ashes of the muscle tissue, the phosphates of potassium and magnesium predominated. Also, bone was predominantly calcium phosphate, and likewise the mucous membranes had a preponderance of potassium chloride. So this list goes on, and he found through his very analytical approach and close observation that he could find associations between various tissues and organs of 12 salts. So what Schussler thought was that if we could identify the tissue that is affected in order to produce a certain pathology, then we could probably correct the disease by delivering the tissue salt associated with that particular tissue. So, in order to identify the disease, we should be able to find out the tissue that was affected. And we shall be looking at this as we progress with the course. So if we would select the suitable tissue salt and dilute that salt in order to facilitate cellular absorption and give it to the person, then we should be able to get good results. In order to deliver the salt at the cellular level, he chose to use the homeopathic style of remedy preparation. And we shall take a quick look at that particular methodology. Briefly stated, Schussler's theory of biochemic therapy was that if we could correct the physiological chemistry of the cell back to its normal state, then we should be able to correct the disease. He was very clear about one thing, and that was we are not trying to supply the body with the deficient minerals. As we said, very little was known about what is going on inside the cell. Very little was known about the size of the cell to a very accurate extent. So he only theorized to the extent possible that it was not to supply the body or the cells with deficient minerals, only about bringing about a balance. And in order to do that, it would be best to stimulate the body to improve the absorption from food itself and then reorganize it inside the tissues. In other words, trying to get the cell to do its job the way it is supposed to do. Some people are still under the impression that these tissue salts are meant to overcome deficiencies in the cell. They are not supplements. They are not mineral supplements that you buy them in the market. So if we are talking about a ferrum phos, which is basically an iron salt, it is not an iron supplement. Schussler decided to use the homeopathic method of preparing his remedies. Principally, there are two steps that are involved in preparing a remedy. One is trituration, which means that the remedy material is ground in a mortar and pestle for a certain number of cycles, along with a dilution with a neutral material, which in most cases is lactose or milk sugar. The next graphic shows the principle of dilution. By dilution, we mean that for each trituration, the remedy is diluted to a tenth, or in some cases to a hundredth. But in the case of Schussler's remedies, they are diluted by a factor of 10. After that, it is again ground for a certain number of cycles, and then it is again diluted in the next process. This process keeps on going for a certain number of times, which we shall see in the slide that will follow shortly. Very briefly, we shall now see what are the tissue salt potencies used in tissue salt therapy. I'll just go through the process of preparation once again. One part of the material, in this graphic it shows a tincture which applies to a liquid potency, but in tissue salts we are using salts in their crystalline form. So instead of a liquid, it's actually a dry powder which is mixed with lactose sugar, as I said earlier. But the mathematics remains the same. So one part is diluted with 9 parts to give a 1x or a 1 decimal potency. That x represents the Roman letter X, which signifies the number 10. Out of that, 1 drop is taken or 1 grain is taken and again diluted with 9 parts. And this process keeps on going until it has reached a potency of 6x. So if we do a dilution in 6 stages and each dilution is to a tenth of its original, then the 6 dilutions will result in a remedy which is having only 1 part in a million of the first preparation. So if you take 1 grain of the remedy, the subsequent dilution and trituration will finally give you just 1 part in a million of the original substance. So it is highly diluted, and it is the trituration that gives it what we call as a potency or the strength. These facts are little understood even today, and that is quite understandable. It has taken more than 100 years to get anywhere close to the cell membrane on which Virchow had theorized 100 years before that. At this point, I would like to point out that our current understanding of the human cell is based on what is known as the fluid mosaic model, and that came into being only in 1973, a full 100 years after Schussler had published his findings. Until that time, we were not very sure of how material is transported across the cell membrane. This is a very sophisticated model and it is still in development. Yet, despite this model, Schussler was able to deliver these salts across the cell membrane by using the homeopathic methodology of drug preparation. Now, the commonly used potencies for the tissue salts are 6x, that means 1 part in a million, also known as 6D, where the D stands for decimal. German areas such as Austria, Germany and Switzerland will call it 6D or 6 decimal, and in other parts of the world where English is the spoken language, then we call that as a 6x. Some people also use a 3x, which is a milder form and a less diluted form, but the most popular form today is the 6x. There are some practitioners who use the 12x or the 12D, and some go as far as the 30x or 30D. During this course, we shall be looking at just the 6x or the 6D potencies. Now, a short historical note. While he was developing these remedies, Schussler had got stuck with one particular remedy, which is calcium sulfate, and he agonized for years whether to include it in his system or not. He included it, then he discarded it, but later his successors brought it back again. Therefore, some very early German works, very early editions of his works have only 11 remedies, and later on, when they were consolidated through clinical experience, then calcium sulfate got its deserved place back. So today we have 12 remedies. So that's an interesting fact, just trivia if you wish. And the interesting part is that all these 12 remedies are in fact part of the mainstream homeopathic remedies as well. And when it comes to homeopathy, of course, they use higher potencies as well, not just the 12x's and the 30x's. they go even higher, where the dilutions are done on the scale of 100 or the centesimal scale. But we are not discussing homeopathy here, and we shall restrict our discussion only to Schussler's biochemic tissue salt therapy only. That brings us to the end of this video, and we shall now summarize the points that we have discussed in this lesson. We talked about the cell theory, which had tremendous influence on Schussler. Then we talked about the fact that Schussler found an association between the salts and the tissues, and he theorized that if the balance of these salts was obtained in the cells, then there should be no disease, because as Virchow had said, all disease pathology can be traced to a pathology of the cells. The main aim of Schussler was to simplify therapeutics. Schussler used the homeopathic preparation method for his remedies because he felt that the dilution and the trituration which potentized the remedy was the best way to deliver the salt at the cellular level. We must understand that it was not until 100 years ago that the transport mechanism across the cell membrane was understood. And even today, that is an ongoing process and developing. The mosaic model is not the final word as far as cell membrane transportation is concerned. And finally, we took a look at what potencies mean and what are the most common potencies that we will be using in the practice of Schussler's biochemic tissue salt therapy. So thank you very much for your attention, and we shall continue with our study in the next lesson. The next video, we shall just take a brief look at finding whether or not biochemic tissue salt therapy has any place under the sun in present times when we feel that we have made tremendous progress in medicine. So until then, bye bye and thank you.